At 76, Richard Gere appears to have lived the kind of life most people could only dream about. He became one of Hollywood's most recognizable leading men, starred in films that defined entire eras, earned worldwide admiration, and built a reputation that extended far beyond the movie screen. To millions of fans, he was the elegant stranger in Pretty Woman, the disciplined naval candidate in An Officer and a Gentleman, and the charismatic performer whose presence could transform an ordinary scene into something unforgettable. Yet behind the polished smile, expensive suits, and romantic image was a man whose journey was far more complicated than the fantasy Hollywood sold to the public. Richard Gere's story is not simply one of fame and success. It is also a story of personal sacrifice, broken relationships, professional consequences, painful misunderstandings, and a lifelong struggle to remain true to himself in an industry that often demands silence. Born in Philadelphia in 1949 and raised in a modest family in New York, Gere did not grow up surrounded by wealth or entertainment industry privilege. He was musically talented, athletic, and intellectually curious, but his path toward acting was uncertain. After leaving college, he pursued theater and slowly built a career through discipline rather than connections. Long before he became an international heartthrob, he experienced rejection, financial uncertainty, and the exhausting reality of trying to survive as a young performer. Those early years shaped the independence that would later define him, but they also taught him that success could disappear without warning. When American Gigolo was released in 1980, Gere was transformed into a symbol of confidence, sophistication, and male beauty. The attention was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, his face appeared on magazine covers around the world, and his private life became public property. Hollywood wanted him to remain mysterious but marketable, rebellious but controllable. Gere, however, never seemed entirely comfortable with celebrity. He wanted to be respected as an actor, yet the public often focused more on his appearance and romantic life than his craft. The image that made him famous also became a kind of prison. His success continued with An Officer and a Gentleman, one of the most beloved romantic dramas of its time. The film strengthened his status as a major star, but behind the scenes, Gere developed a reputation for being intense, guarded, and unwilling to participate in Hollywood's social games. While many actors build alliances through parties, publicity, and studio relationships, Gere increasingly turned inward. He explored Buddhism, meditation, humanitarian causes, and questions about suffering and compassion. These interests gave him purpose, but they also pushed him further away from the conventional Hollywood system. Then came Pretty Woman in 1990. The film became a cultural phenomenon and made Gere part of one of cinema's most famous romantic pairings alongside Julia Roberts. Audiences saw wealth, fantasy, transformation, and love. Gere's character, Edward Lewis, seemed powerful and emotionally controlled, but his quiet vulnerability gave the film its heart. Ironically, the movie's fairy tale ending contrasted sharply with the uncertainty of Gere's own personal relationships. His marriage to supermodel Cindy Crawford seemed, from the outside, like a perfect union between two global icons. They were glamorous, successful, and constantly photographed. But the relationship ended after only a few years. Both were under extraordinary pressure, and their lives moved at a pace that left little room for stability. The divorce became another public spectacle, forcing Gere to experience private disappointment under the judgment of strangers. Years later, Crawford suggested that their age difference and different stages of life played a role in their separation. For Gere, the end of the marriage marked another reminder that fame could not guarantee intimacy or permanence. His later marriage to actress Carrie Lowell brought him a son and a period of greater domestic stability. Fatherhood reportedly transformed his priorities. He became more protective of his private life and less interested in chasing blockbuster roles. But that marriage also ended, followed by a prolonged and highly publicized divorce. Once again, deeply personal matters became material for headlines. Property, finances, and custody were discussed in public as though they were scenes from a film. For a man who had spent decades searching for spiritual peace, the conflict was undoubtedly a difficult chapter. Yet perhaps the most unusual struggle of Richard Gere's career came not from a failed film or personal scandal, but from his political convictions. Gere became one of the entertainment industry's most outspoken supporters of Tibet and the Dalai Lama. He repeatedly criticized the Chinese government's policies in Tibet, even when doing so carried professional risks. His activism reportedly complicated his relationship with major studios and international financing partners. As China became increasingly important to the global film business, Gere's position made him a controversial figure. Roles became less frequent, and some observers believed his political views contributed to his reduced presence in major Hollywood productions. For many actors, losing access to blockbuster projects would have felt like a devastating rejection. But Gere refused to abandon the causes he believed in. That decision reveals both the dignity and tragedy of his story. He was willing to sacrifice career opportunities for his principles. Yet the price of integrity can be loneliness, misunderstanding, and exclusion. Hollywood celebrates courage in movies, but in real life, courage can make powerful people uncomfortable. As Richard Gere entered his 70s, he appeared to find renewed happiness through his marriage to Alejandra Silva and their growing family. He stepped further away from the frantic machinery of American celebrity and embraced a quieter existence. Still, time carries its own sadness. The roles that once made him a symbol of eternal romance now belong to another era. Friends, colleagues, and loved ones have aged or passed away. The industry that once placed him at its center has changed beyond recognition. Richard Gere's tragedy is not that his life was destroyed. It is that behind one of Hollywood's most glamorous careers was a man repeatedly forced to choose between public approval and personal truth. He gained almost everything fame could offer, only to discover that the most important things, peace, loyalty, love, purpose, and family, could never be guaranteed by applause. But the deeper one looks into Richard Gere's life, the clearer it becomes that his greatest battles were rarely visible on a red carpet. His public image suggested calm, refinement, and emotional control, yet the man behind that image often seemed caught between two worlds. One was the world that made him famous, a world built on beauty, commerce, attention, and carefully manufactured desire. The other was the world he increasingly sought through spirituality, compassion, and distance from ego. Those two worlds were never entirely compatible, and much of Gere's life can be understood as an attempt to survive the tension between them. Hollywood had rewarded him for being desirable, but Gere gradually became suspicious of desire itself. Buddhism taught him to examine attachment, suffering, impermanence, and the restless hunger of the human mind. These ideas were far removed from an industry obsessed with opening weekend numbers, status, youth, and relevance. While other stars worked constantly to protect their place in the spotlight, Gere often appeared willing to let the spotlight move away from him. To some, that looked like courage. To others, it looked like career decline. Perhaps it was both. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Gere was still capable of commanding major roles. Films such as Runaway Bride reunited him with Julia Roberts and revived the romantic chemistry that audiences remembered from Pretty Woman. Later, Chicago allowed him to reveal a different side of his talent. As the slick attorney Billy Flynn, he was charming, manipulative, theatrical, and sharply self-aware. The performance earned him significant recognition and reminded Hollywood that Richard Gere was more than a handsome face. He could sing, dance, dominate a scene, and balance humor with menace. Yet even at the height of renewed success, Gere's relationship with fame remained complicated. He did not seem interested in maintaining the conventional rhythm of stardom. He was selective about roles and increasingly devoted his attention to causes outside cinema. His humanitarian work addressed homelessness, human rights, public health, and the Tibetan cause. These were not temporary publicity campaigns arranged to promote a film. They were long-term commitments that became central to his identity. That commitment came with consequences. Gere's political statements did not always fit comfortably within the entertainment industry's financial interests. Hollywood had become dependent on global markets, and China's growing influence made studios cautious about any figure considered politically sensitive. Gere never claimed that every professional disappointment was caused by his activism, but the pattern was difficult to ignore. Large studio opportunities became less common. Films that once would have been obvious vehicles for him went elsewhere. His name remained famous, but his place within the system became less secure. There is something deeply ironic about that outcome. Gere had spent years playing powerful men, businessmen, officers, lawyers, journalists, and politicians. Yet in real life, his willingness to challenge power may have reduced his own influence. The industry admired actors who portrayed moral courage, but it was less enthusiastic when an actor practiced it at a financial cost. Gere became a reminder that conviction is easy to celebrate when it is fictional and much harder to tolerate when it disrupts business. His spiritual journey also exposed him to ridicule. For years, celebrity culture treated his devotion to Buddhism as an eccentricity. Photographs of Gere with the Dalai Lama were sometimes presented as though they reflected an unusual hobby rather than a serious philosophical commitment. His attempts to speak about compassion, suffering, and responsibility were often overshadowed by gossip about his relationships. It was another example of how fame can flatten a human being into a few convenient images. The rumors surrounding Gere's private life were often especially cruel. Like many major celebrities, he became the subject of bizarre and persistent stories that had no credible foundation. These rumors spread before social media, demonstrating that misinformation did not begin with the internet. Tabloids and late-night jokes repeated sensational claims until millions of people recognized them, even if few could identify where they began. Gere rarely dignified such stories with lengthy responses, but silence did not erase them. For any person, being mocked through invented stories would be painful. For Gere, it revealed the darker side of celebrity. Once the public believes it owns an image of someone, truth can become less entertaining than humiliation. A false rumor can travel farther than a lifetime of honest work. No award, performance, or humanitarian effort can completely prevent strangers from reducing a person to a joke. At the same time, Gere was facing ordinary human struggles beneath extraordinary public attention. His second marriage, to Carrie Lowell, lasted much longer than his first and produced his eldest son, Homer. Fatherhood brought a new emotional center to his life. Gere had spent decades traveling, filming, campaigning, and searching for meaning. Becoming a parent required a different form of presence. It was no longer enough to speak about compassion in public. He had to practice patience and responsibility inside a family. When the marriage ended, the separation became long and difficult. Divorce is painful even in private, but celebrity divorce transforms pain into content. Every legal disagreement can become a headline. Every financial question can be turned into speculation. Every silence can be interpreted as hostility. Gere and Lowell eventually reached a settlement. But the years of uncertainty represented another period in which his personal life unfolded under public observation. The experience may also have reinforced his desire to leave behind the noise that had surrounded him for so long. As he grew older, Gere seemed less interested in proving anything to Hollywood. He had already been the romantic hero, the dramatic leading man, the box office star, and the award-winning performer. What remained was the more difficult question. Who was he when none of those labels mattered? His later relationship with Alejandra Silva offered a new answer. Their marriage brought companionship, family, and a sense of renewal at an age when many people assume life's most important chapters are already complete. Gere became a father again later in life, welcoming young children while entering his 70s. The contrast was striking. The man who had once represented youthful desire on movie screens was now experiencing sleepless nights, parental responsibility, and the fragile joy of raising children during the final decades of his life. That joy, however, carries its own quiet sorrow. Older parenthood can intensify awareness of time. Every birthday becomes precious because the future feels less unlimited. Every family moment may contain both gratitude and fear. Gere had gained another chance at domestic happiness. but he could not escape the knowledge that age creates boundaries even love cannot remove. And so the tragedy of Richard Gere is not a single catastrophic event. It is a collection of sacrifices, misunderstandings, endings, and difficult choices. It is the sadness of being seen by millions while remaining unknown. It is the cost of becoming an image when one is still trying to become a whole person. It is the pain of discovering that success can open every door except the one leading to lasting peace. Yet Richard Gere's search for peace did not lead him toward isolation from the suffering of others. In many ways, the opposite happened. The more he withdrew from Hollywood's machinery, the more deeply he involved himself in humanitarian work. He used his fame to draw attention to homelessness, poverty, public health, refugees, and human rights. For Gere, compassion was not simply a private spiritual principle. It had to become action. But carrying the suffering of others can create an emotional burden of its own, especially when the problems seem endless and the institutions capable of solving them move painfully slowly. His work connected him with people whose lives were far removed from the luxury associated with movie stardom. He visited communities facing displacement, illness, and political oppression. He listened to stories that did not end with a director calling cut. There were no carefully written conclusions, no music rising at the perfect moment, and no guarantee that justice would arrive before the credits. These encounters likely changed the way he understood both privilege and responsibility. They also placed him in situations where his celebrity could open doors but could not erase suffering. The Tibetan cause remained especially important to him. His relationship with the Dalai Lama and his defense of Tibetan culture became defining elements of his public identity. Gere repeatedly spoke about religious freedom and human dignity, even when the subject made powerful governments and business interests uncomfortable. He did not treat the issue as a fashionable campaign that could be abandoned when public attention moved elsewhere. His commitment lasted for decades. That persistence was admirable, but it also complicated his career. The modern film industry increasingly depended on international distribution, and access to the Chinese market became a major financial consideration. Studios had strong incentives to avoid controversy. An actor openly critical of the Chinese government could therefore become a commercial risk, regardless of his talent or popularity. Gere later acknowledged that major productions had become more difficult for him to secure, and he suggested that his political position had played a role. The loss was not merely financial. Acting had been his craft, his identity, and the central discipline of his adult life. To find himself gradually pushed toward smaller projects must have carried a sense of rejection. Hollywood rarely announces that someone has been excluded. There is no formal letter declaring that a career has changed. The phone simply rings less often. Meetings disappear. Scripts stop arriving. Roles go to other actors. The silence can be more painful than direct criticism because it leaves a person wondering which decision closed the door. Still, Gere adapted. He turned toward independent films, where stories were often more complex and less dependent on conventional heroism. In Arbitrage, he played a wealthy businessman whose polished exterior concealed corruption and fear. In Time Out of Mind, he portrayed a homeless man wandering through New York, nearly invisible to the people around him. The role stripped away the elegance audiences associated with Gere. There were no tailored suits, romantic fantasies, or reassuring signs of status. Instead, the film confronted viewers with loneliness, humiliation, and the terrifying ease with which a person can fall outside society's protection. That performance carried particular significance because homelessness had long been one of Gere's humanitarian concerns. During filming, he spent time on the streets in character and discovered how quickly people could look through him as though he were not there. Passers-by who might have recognized Richard Gere on a movie poster failed to see the exhausted man standing nearby. The experience illustrated one of the cruelest realities of social suffering. A person does not need to disappear physically to become invisible. For Gere, who had spent much of his life being watched, photographed, admired, and pursued, the contrast must have been profound. Fame had made him impossible to ignore, while the role showed him what it meant to be ignored completely. Both conditions could be dehumanizing. In one, The public sees an image instead of a person. In the other, it refuses to see the person at all. As he moved deeper into later life, Gere also had to confront the changing physical reality of aging. Hollywood had once sold him as an ideal of masculine beauty. His hair, posture, voice, and restrained confidence became part of his screen identity. But no actor can permanently preserve the face that first made audiences fall in love. The industry is especially unforgiving toward age, constantly searching for younger stars and newer fantasies. Gere appeared to accept this transition with more grace than many performers. He did not desperately attempt to recreate the romantic hero of his youth. He allowed himself to play flawed fathers, compromised businessmen, aging professionals, and men haunted by choices they could no longer undo. Yet acceptance does not necessarily eliminate grief. Growing older means watching a version of oneself disappear. For an actor, that disappearance happens publicly, preserved in films that allow the world to compare the present with the past. Every screening of Pretty Woman presents Gere as the man he once was. Youthful, composed, and seemingly untouched by time. Audiences can return to that version whenever they wish. Gere cannot. He must continue forward while millions remember him through an image frozen more than 3 decades ago. That is one of cinema's strangest cruelties. It gives actors a form of immortality, while constantly reminding them that their real bodies remain mortal. His later family life offered a powerful counterbalance to that awareness. With Alejandra Silva, Gere appeared to build a quieter and more grounded existence. Their relationship attracted attention because of their age difference, but both emphasized shared values, spirituality, and humanitarian interests. Gere was no longer simply searching for a partner who could survive the pressures of fame. He seemed to have found someone who understood the life he wanted beyond it. The arrival of young children brought renewal, but it also sharpened the reality of time. Gere entered fatherhood again at an age when many men are becoming grandfathers. He spoke with gratitude about family life, yet the emotional complexity is impossible to ignore. A father in his 70s knows that he may not witness every milestone. He may wonder how old he will be at a graduation, a wedding, or the birth of another generation. These calculations can remain unspoken, but they exist beneath the joy. That may be the most heartbreaking dimension of Richard Gere's later years. After decades of searching, he appears to have found the peace, love, and family life that fame could never provide. But he found them while becoming more conscious than ever that time is limited. Happiness arrived not as a permanent victory, but as something fragile that must be treasured precisely because it cannot last forever. That awareness of time appears to have changed the way Richard Gere measures success. Earlier in his life, success could be counted in box office receipts, magazine covers, awards, and the size of the next role. By his 70s, those measurements seemed increasingly hollow. A career can be celebrated by millions and still leave a person wondering whether he was fully present for the people closest to him. A film can become a classic, yet the months spent making it can never be returned. Applause fades quickly, while the consequences of absence may remain inside a family for years. Gere's decision to move much of his life away from the center of Hollywood reflected more than a change of address. It represented a rejection of the system that had once defined him. For decades, Los Angeles had been the symbolic capital of his profession, a place where careers were created through proximity, visibility, and constant negotiation. To step away from that environment was to risk becoming less relevant. In Hollywood, absence is rarely neutral. When an actor stops attending the right events, meeting the right executives, or appearing in the right publications, the industry quickly begins looking elsewhere. But Gere had already experienced the cost of relevance. He knew what it meant to have strangers speculate about his relationships, appearance, beliefs, and private decisions. He knew how easily admiration could become mockery and how quickly a successful actor could be treated as yesterday's news. Distance offered something fame could not: the possibility of living without turning every moment into a performance. His later years also revealed a more reflective side of his relationship with acting. He no longer needed every character to make him appear heroic or desirable. Instead, he seemed drawn to men facing moral compromise, regret, loneliness, or the consequences of choices made long ago. These roles mirrored the emotional territory of aging. By a certain point in life, people are no longer defined only by what they hope to become. They are also defined by what they failed to repair. That idea was powerfully present in Norman, the moderate rise and tragic fall of a New York fixer. Gere played a man desperate to be important, useful, and connected. Norman lives through introductions, promises, and relationships with powerful people, but beneath his constant activity is a profound fear of insignificance. The performance was far removed from the controlled confidence of Gere's younger roles. Norman is awkward, vulnerable, and painfully dependent on the approval of others. The character could be seen as a dark reflection of celebrity itself. Fame creates a network of people who appear close as long as success continues. Invitations arrive, calls are returned, and friendships seem abundant. But when influence weakens, many of those relationships disappear. The person who once felt surrounded may discover that he was surrounded not by loyalty, but by opportunity. Gere had witnessed enough of Hollywood to understand that distinction. He had experienced enormous popularity, professional exclusion, critical revival, and periods when the industry appeared uncertain what to do with him. Through it all, he maintained an identity beyond acting. His spiritual beliefs and humanitarian commitments gave him a foundation that did not depend entirely on whether a studio considered him profitable. Yet, even spiritual conviction does not make a person immune to pain. Buddhism teaches impermanence, but understanding impermanence intellectually is different from living through it. Relationships still end. Parents die. Children grow older. Friends disappear. The body changes. A person can accept that loss is inevitable and still feel devastated when it arrives. Gere's parents played an important role in shaping the man he became. He frequently spoke with affection about his family and the values of responsibility and decency that surrounded his upbringing. His father, Homer Gere, lived to an extraordinary age, allowing father and son to share a bond across many decades. But such longevity carries a complicated emotional reality. The longer someone remains in our lives, the more impossible their absence can feel. When Gere lost his father, it marked the closing of a foundational chapter. No matter how old a person becomes, the death of a parent can create the strange sensation of being unprotected. A familiar voice is gone. The person who remembers one's earliest years is no longer available to confirm them. Success offers no defense against that emptiness. One can be an international star and still become, in grief, simply a son missing his father. The passage of time also transformed Gere's relationship with his own children. His eldest son grew into adulthood, while Gere began raising younger children with Alejandra. His family therefore connected dramatically different stages of life. He could observe one child becoming independent while others were still discovering the world. This must have offered him a rare perspective on how quickly childhood vanishes. For younger parents, exhaustion can make ordinary moments feel endless. For an older father, those same moments may feel painfully brief. A bedtime story, a walk through the garden, or a child's hand resting inside his can carry enormous emotional weight. Gere likely understood that these simple experiences were more precious than any premiere. But he also knew they could not be preserved. The public often imagines the later years of a successful actor as a peaceful conclusion. The star has money, recognition, and the freedom to choose how to live. But aging does not provide a neat ending. It introduces new responsibilities, physical limitations, family concerns, and questions about legacy. It forces a person to ask not only what he achieved, but what his achievements meant. For Richard Gere, legacy is complicated. He will always be remembered as one of cinema's great romantic leading men. Pretty Woman alone guarantees that his younger face will continue reaching audiences who were not alive when the film premiered. But he may also be remembered for choices that were less commercially convenient. defending Tibet, supporting displaced people, advocating for the homeless, and refusing to separate compassion from public life. Those commitments may ultimately reveal more about him than the elegant characters he portrayed. Movies gave Gere an image, but his choices gave that image substance. He could have remained silent, accepted the largest available roles, and protected his relationship with powerful studios. Instead, he repeatedly chose positions that placed his comfort and career at risk. Still, sacrifice does not guarantee victory. Tibet's political situation was not transformed simply because a famous actor spoke out. Homelessness did not disappear because he portrayed an invisible man on the streets of New York. Human suffering remained vast, and Gere's influence, however significant, had limits. That realization can be painful for anyone devoted to humanitarian work. Compassion creates the desire to help, but reality constantly reveals how much cannot be fixed by one person. And perhaps this is where the real heartbreak of Richard Gere's story resides. He spent much of his life searching for meaning beyond fame, only to discover that meaning does not eliminate sorrow. It makes sorrow more visible. Love creates the fear of loss. Fatherhood creates awareness of time. Compassion exposes suffering. Integrity brings consequences. Peace is not the absence of pain, but the courage to remain open despite it. That courage became increasingly important as Richard Gere entered a stage of life in which the past could no longer be treated as something distant. At 76, memories do not simply sit quietly behind a person. They return with greater force. Old decisions become clearer. Missed opportunities acquire new meaning. Faces from earlier chapters appear in photographs, films, and unexpected moments, reminding him of versions of himself that no longer exist. For Gere, those memories are preserved more visibly than they are for most people. His youth remains available to the world in perfect detail. Audiences can watch him walk through Manhattan in American Gigolo, confront fear in An Officer and a Gentleman, or stand beside Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. His voice, expressions, and movements from decades ago remain untouched by time. The man watching those scenes today, however, carries everything that happened afterward. That creates a strange division between public memory and private reality. To viewers, a beloved film may feel timeless. To the actor, it may recall a demanding production, a relationship ending, a family member growing ill, or a period of uncertainty hidden behind promotional interviews. The public remembers the fantasy. The performer remembers the cost. Pretty Woman became one of the greatest blessings of Gere's career, but it also fixed him permanently inside a romantic ideal. Edward Lewis was wealthy, controlled, and ultimately transformed by love. The character offered audiences the comforting belief that loneliness could be cured through one extraordinary encounter. Real life was never so simple. Gere's own relationships required compromise, patience, privacy, and endurance, qualities that cannot be compressed into a 2-hour story. His marriage to Cindy Crawford, in particular, remained a source of fascination long after it ended. The two appeared to represent physical perfection, yet glamour could not protect them from incompatibility. Their relationship unfolded under relentless attention, with strangers evaluating every appearance and interpreting every gesture. Crawford was building her own global career, while Gere was already established and moving toward a more spiritual, private existence. Their lives overlapped, but they were not necessarily moving in the same direction. The breakup challenged the public illusion that beauty and success naturally create happiness. In reality, two admired people can still feel misunderstood. They can love each other and remain unable to build the same future. They can appear flawless in photographs while struggling with questions no camera can capture. The tragedy was not scandal or betrayal, but the ordinary sadness of discovering that affection is sometimes insufficient. Gere's second marriage offered deeper stability and the life-changing experience of becoming a father. Yet its collapse was perhaps more painful because more was at stake. A marriage involving a child is not only the end of a romantic partnership. It is the reorganization of an entire family. Holidays change, Homes change. Daily routines disappear. Parents must learn to remain connected through responsibility even when emotional trust has been damaged. The lengthy nature of the divorce intensified that strain. Legal proceedings can turn personal history into evidence and shared property into conflict. Memories once associated with intimacy become subjects of negotiation. For someone devoted to ideas of compassion and inner peace, participating in such a process may have felt especially disorienting. Spiritual practice does not prevent anger, disappointment, or fear. It only asks a person to confront those emotions without allowing them to become the whole self. After the divorce, Gere could have retreated completely from the possibility of lasting love. He had already experienced 2 marriages, public scrutiny, and the emotional exhaustion of separation. Many people would have decided that intimacy carried too much risk. Instead, he remained open to another beginning. His relationship with Alejandra Silva developed during a period when both had already lived through significant personal change. Their connection was not built around the youthful belief that love would solve every problem. It emerged from shared interests, humanitarian commitments, and a desire for a more meaningful life. Gere had spent decades learning that attraction could create a relationship, but values were needed to sustain one. Their marriage appeared to bring him a kind of domestic peace that had often been missing. He spoke less like a movie star protecting an image and more like a man grateful to have found a stable emotional home. Yet happiness late in life can produce a special form of vulnerability. When a person finally receives what he has long searched for, the fear of losing it can become stronger. This was especially true after Gere became a father again. The birth of his younger sons brought energy and purpose into his later years. Their lives were beginning while his own had entered its final major chapters. He could watch them experience the world for the first time, but he could not ignore the difference between their horizons and his. A young child assumes a parent will always be present. The parent knows otherwise. Gere could offer love, wisdom, and security, but he could not bargain with time. Every year would increase the age gap. Every milestone would carry an unspoken calculation. How old would he be when they became teenagers? Would he be strong enough to participate in the lives they wanted? Would they remember the full man he had been, or only the elderly father of their childhood? These are difficult questions because they have no comforting answer. Wealth can provide excellent care and opportunity, but it cannot guarantee years. Fame can preserve a face on film, but it cannot replace the presence of a father at the moments his children may need him most. Perhaps Gere understood this more sharply after the death of his own father. Homer Gere had lived for more than a century, becoming a symbol of endurance within the family. Richard had enjoyed an unusually long relationship with him, yet no amount of time could make the final separation easy. The loss reminded him that even the strongest family bonds eventually confront silence. It may also have deepened his commitment to being present. Gere could not control the length of his life, but he could control the quality of attention he gave his family. He could choose breakfast at home over another industry event. He could choose a quiet afternoon with his children over the temporary excitement of being photographed. These decisions might appear small, but they represented a radical shift from the demands of celebrity. Hollywood teaches actors to fear invisibility. Family teaches them that being truly seen by a few people may matter more than being recognized by millions. Gere had spent decades entering rooms where everyone knew his name. In later life, he seemed to value the rooms where his name was unnecessary, where he was simply a husband, father, son, or friend. That transformation does not erase the sadness of aging. It does not restore broken relationships or recover years spent chasing success. But it reveals the final lesson inside Richard Gere's heartbreaking journey. A meaningful life is not one without regret. It is one in which regret becomes wisdom, loss becomes compassion, and the remaining time is no longer wasted pretending that anything lasts forever. And yet, even wisdom does not arrive without a cost. Richard Gere's later life suggests that every lesson he gained was paid for through disappointment, distance, or loss. He learned the limits of fame because fame had once surrounded him. He learned the value of privacy because privacy had repeatedly been taken away. He learned the importance of family because relationships had broken apart. He learned compassion because he had spent years confronting forms of suffering that money and influence could not easily solve. From the outside, his life still appeared privileged. He had financial security, international recognition, and the freedom to choose where and how he lived. But privilege does not cancel emotional pain. In fact, it can sometimes make that pain more difficult to explain. When the world assumes someone has everything, there is little room for that person to admit loneliness, fear, or regret. Suffering becomes almost embarrassing, as though success removes the right to feel wounded. Gere understood this contradiction through the characters he played. Many of his most memorable roles involved men who appeared powerful but were emotionally incomplete. Edward Lewis in Pretty Woman possessed wealth and control, yet he was isolated. Zach Mayo in An Officer and a Gentleman presented toughness as protection against abandonment. Billy Flynn in Chicago used charm and performance to manipulate how others saw reality. Again and again, Gere portrayed men who had mastered the outside world while struggling with what remained unresolved inside them. Perhaps those roles resonated because Gere understood how easily confidence can become armor. His calm public manner often gave the impression that he was untouched by criticism. But no person is completely protected from decades of judgment. Every failed film, broken marriage, cruel rumor, political controversy, and public misunderstanding leaves some trace. The damage may not be visible, but it becomes part of the emotional weight a person carries forward. One of the greatest burdens of long-term celebrity is the loss of control over one's own story. Gere could speak openly about Buddhism, humanitarian work, fatherhood, or acting, yet the media could still reduce him to a romantic image from the 1980s or a sensational rumor from the past. A public figure may spend years trying to show who he truly is, only to discover that many people prefer the simpler version they already know. This gap between the real man and the public character followed Gere throughout his career. He was seen as glamorous, but he often sought simplicity. He was marketed as a symbol of desire, but he became increasingly interested in detachment. He was expected to protect his career, but he repeatedly spoke about causes that could damage it. He was one of the most recognizable actors alive, yet he seemed most comfortable when recognition no longer mattered. That contradiction also explains why his departure from the center of Hollywood felt so significant. Some stars fight aging by remaining constantly visible. They accept every interview, every franchise, every nostalgic reunion, and every opportunity to remind audiences of their importance. Gere took a different path. His absence became part of his identity. He allowed younger actors to occupy the space he once commanded. There was dignity in that choice, but also sadness. The film industry moves quickly, and once a star steps away, returning can be difficult. Audiences change. Studios change. The definition of a leading man changes. An actor who once carried major productions can suddenly be treated as a supporting figure from another generation. The same industry that once celebrated his face begins speaking about him in the language of legacy. Legacy is a comforting word, but it also signals that the most visible period of a life is considered complete. It places a person in the past even while he is still alive. For Gere, being described as an icon may have felt both flattering and unsettling. An icon is remembered, admired, and preserved, but it is not necessarily invited to keep changing. Still, Gere continued to evolve. His interest in spiritual practice deepened rather than disappeared. His humanitarian commitments remained central. His understanding of family became more urgent. Instead of trying to recreate his younger self, he appeared willing to accept a new identity shaped by age. Acceptance, however, is not surrender. It is not the belief that nothing more matters. For Gere, acceptance seemed to mean choosing more carefully. Time was no longer an abstract resource. Each film required months away from family. Each public appearance carried a cost. Each controversy could distract from the work he valued most. The question was no longer whether he could remain famous, but whether fame still deserved his limited attention. This perspective likely influenced his decision to build a quieter life with Alejandra and their children. Domestic routines offered something the entertainment industry never could: repetition without performance. A morning meal did not need an audience. A conversation with a child did not need to become content. A family walk did not need to produce a headline. These ordinary moments allowed Gere to exist without being evaluated. For someone who had spent most of his adult life under observation, ordinariness may have become a form of freedom. There is peace in being unnecessary to the public for a few hours. There is relief in entering a room where no one cares about box office history. There is healing in being loved by people who are not impressed by an old movie poster. But even this peace remained fragile. Older age brings practical concerns that cannot be solved through philosophy alone. Energy changes. Recovery takes longer. Health becomes less predictable. The body begins imposing boundaries that ambition once ignored. Gere may have accepted aging publicly, but acceptance does not mean he never feared what it could take from him. The greatest fear was likely not the loss of appearance or professional relevance. It was the possibility of losing time with his children. Becoming a father again later in life gave him another chance to experience wonder, but it also created a responsibility extending far into a future he could not fully guarantee. The happiness was real, yet so was the uncertainty. This emotional tension gives Gere's later years their deepest poignancy. He had finally reached a point where he seemed less divided between ambition and meaning. He had a family, a spiritual foundation, and the freedom to live beyond Hollywood's demands. Yet the very clarity he achieved made him more aware of how little time remains to enjoy it. That is the cruel paradox of aging. People often spend decades pursuing what they believe will make them happy. When they finally understand what truly matters, the years ahead are fewer than the years behind. The lesson arrives, but it arrives late. Peace becomes possible just as time becomes precious. Richard Gere's life, therefore, cannot be reduced to triumph or tragedy. It contains both at once. He achieved extraordinary success, yet success failed to protect him from heartbreak. He found love, yet love made him vulnerable to loss. He discovered purpose, yet purpose exposed him to suffering. He gained wisdom, yet wisdom came with the knowledge that nothing, not beauty, fame, family, or life itself, can be held forever. And perhaps that is why Richard Gere's story continues to affect people so deeply. It is not merely the story of a famous actor growing older. It is the story of a man who spent much of his life surrounded by admiration, yet repeatedly discovered that admiration could not answer the most difficult human questions. What does success mean when a marriage ends? What does public recognition matter when a loved one is gone? What value does wealth have when time cannot be purchased? These questions become more urgent with age, and at 76, Gere's life appears shaped less by what he conquered than by what he learned to release. For decades, the public viewed him through scenes of romance and control. He was the man who entered a room with quiet authority, the man whose confidence seemed effortless, and the man audiences expected to rescue or be rescued by love. But those characters concealed the uncertainty of the actor playing them. Gere's real life did not follow a screenplay. There were no guaranteed reconciliations, no perfectly timed declarations, and no final scene in which every wound was healed. This difference between cinematic love and real love may have become increasingly clear to him. Films usually focus on the moment two people come together. Real relationships are defined by what happens afterward. They require patience during disappointment, loyalty during change, and the willingness to remain present when excitement gives way to routine. Gere experienced relationships that began under extraordinary attention, but even extraordinary beginnings could not guarantee lasting harmony. His first marriage became an international spectacle because both partners represented glamour at its highest level. The public treated their union almost like a cultural event, which made its collapse feel equally dramatic. Yet for the two people involved, the ending was not entertainment. It was the private recognition that affection, attraction, and public approval could not resolve the differences between their lives. His second marriage brought greater maturity, fatherhood, and years of shared history. Its ending therefore carried a different kind of pain. When a long relationship breaks down, the loss extends beyond the partner. It affects identity, daily structure, mutual friendships, and the meaning of the past. Years once remembered as a shared life must be reconsidered from two separate perspectives. Gere's eventual decision to marry again demonstrated that disappointment had not made him completely cynical. Remaining open to love after public heartbreak requires courage. It also requires the acceptance that no relationship comes with certainty. His later family life seemed to represent not the innocence of a first beginning, but the hope of someone who understood the risks and chose connection anyway. That choice may reveal more strength than any role he performed on screen. It is easy to appear fearless when a script guarantees survival. It is harder to risk emotional pain again after already experiencing it. Gere's later happiness was therefore not evidence that his earlier losses had ceased to matter. It was evidence that those losses had not destroyed his ability to trust. The same resilience appeared in his career. Hollywood's attention can be intoxicating, and losing it can feel like a form of personal disappearance. Gere had once been among the industry's most bankable and discussed stars. His presence could define a film's identity. Yet over time, the number and scale of his mainstream roles changed. Some of this shift was natural. Every generation produces new stars, and even the most successful actors eventually face an industry eager for younger faces. But Gere's political advocacy also made his professional position more complicated. His outspoken support for Tibet and criticism of Chinese policy did not fit comfortably with the commercial priorities of an increasingly global film business. It would have been easy for him to soften his public position. A carefully worded statement, a strategic silence, or a gradual withdrawal from activism might have reduced professional tension. Instead, he continued to speak about the cause. Whether one agrees with every aspect of his position or not, the personal cost of maintaining it was real. The tragedy lies in the way modern fame often rewards conformity while pretending to celebrate individuality. Actors are encouraged to appear bold as long as their boldness does not interfere with financing, distribution, or access. Gere discovered that the industry's tolerance for conviction had limits. His principles may have strengthened his sense of self while weakening his commercial opportunities. Yet he did not respond by disappearing into bitterness. He continued acting in projects that offered emotional complexity, often choosing characters far removed from the romantic ideal that had made him famous. These performances showed a willingness to appear weak, compromised, isolated, or morally uncertain. Gere no longer needed the audience to admire every man he portrayed. He seemed more interested in revealing how people fail themselves and others. This evolution was important because aging actors are often pressured to repeat their greatest success. The public wants familiar gestures, familiar chemistry, and familiar stories. Nostalgia can become profitable, but it can also become another prison. Gere resisted being preserved only as Edward Lewis or as the uniformed young man carried forever in the final moments of an officer and a gentleman. Those images remained part of him, but they were no longer the whole story. The older Gere carried different emotional material: regret, responsibility, mortality, and the exhaustion of someone who had already spent decades being interpreted by strangers. His later performances often seemed quieter because they did not need to announce themselves. The smallest hesitation or expression could communicate a lifetime of unspoken history. Outside acting, he continued to direct attention toward people whose suffering was less visible than his own public struggles. His advocacy for those experiencing homelessness was particularly meaningful because it challenged the way society decides which lives deserve attention. Gere knew what it meant to be watched everywhere he went, but his work exposed him to individuals who were almost never truly seen. This contrast may have deepened his understanding of loneliness. Celebrity loneliness comes from being recognized without being known. Social invisibility comes from not being recognized as fully human at all. The conditions are profoundly different, yet both involve a failure of genuine connection. In each case, the person becomes an object, one of fascination, the other of avoidance. Gere's spiritual beliefs encouraged him to resist that objectification by looking more carefully at human suffering. Compassion demanded that he see people beyond labels such as celebrity, homeless, refugee, prisoner, or stranger. But compassion also made it impossible to remain comfortably detached. Once suffering is seen clearly, ignoring it becomes a moral choice. That is another burden Gere accepted. He could have used retirement age to withdraw from every difficult issue. He had already given decades to public causes. No reasonable person could have accused him of doing nothing. Yet the values he embraced were not temporary duties. They became the way he understood his place in the world. Still, even the strongest commitment cannot stop time. At 76, the future is naturally measured differently. Plans that once stretched across decades may now be considered in years. Physical energy becomes more valuable. Family moments become harder to sacrifice. The desire to remain useful competes with the need to remain present. Richard Gere now stands at a place where his greatest achievement may not be a film, an award, or a famous romantic scene. It may be the fact that after everything, the exposure, the mockery, the broken relationships, the career compromises, and the losses, he did not close himself off from life. He continued to love, to act, to speak, and to care. That does not make his journey less heartbreaking. It makes the heartbreak meaningful. His story reminds us that strength is not the absence of wounds. Strength is the refusal to let those wounds become the final definition of a life.